After America is made on the lands of the Kure Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
G'day, and welcome to this special crossover episode of Follow the Money and After America. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. It was billed by some as the biggest diplomatic test of Anthony Albanese's prime ministership, but in the end, Albo's meeting with President Donald Trump went off really without a hitch, more or less.
It's great to have the Prime Minister of Australia. Fantastic place.
We are great friends and we're great allies.
We are discussing critical minerals and rare earths.
We have stood side by side for freedom and democracy.
Did an ambassador say something bad about it? Don't tell me. I don't. Where is he? Is he still working for you?
Yeah.
I don't like you either. I don't, and I probably never will.
By Trump's standards, it was actually pretty dull. Making things that sedate is actually a diplomatic success for the Prime Minister and his team, because we've all seen just how quickly meetings in the court of Trump can turn sour. There was talk of a critical minerals deal worth billions of dollars and even an assurance that the United States would deliver all those AUKUS submarines.
How can you guarantee Australia will get the bonds?
Oh, it's getting. Oh, no, they're getting it.
But beyond the pageantry of the White House diplomacy, was there anything of real substance to come from that meeting? Joining me today to talk about the Trump-Albanese meeting, AUKUS, as well as the future of the United States-Australia relationship, is Australia Institute Director of International and Security Affairs, Dr. Emma Shortis. G'day, Emma.
Hey, Eb, thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. As always, there's a never-ending amount of news out of the Trump White House, but this was a pretty big meeting for Anthony Albanese, a long time in the works. It's been hailed as a success. Was it really?
I think if we measure it by the standards of diplomacy, which are pretty narrow generally, then it was a success. You know, I think, Eb, you kind of outlined it in your introduction. There was so much at stake going into this meeting. You know, meetings with Trump can go so incredibly badly. They can be volatile and unpredictable. They can be humiliating. And none of that really happened. And that's hard to do. You know, we know that's really hard to do. So I think credit where credit is due. The Prime Minister handled it really well. And I think he especially handled that, you know, what's being described as that awkward cringe moment with Kevin Rudd very well. That could have gone off the rails really quickly and he made sure it didn't, I think. So yeah, I think full credit to them in that sense. But I also would say that that's a fairly narrow way of measuring success. You know, we kind of tend to measure success in Australian diplomacy as something going very smoothly and nothing really changing. And that's what happened. You know, I would argue that, you know, maybe the Prime Minister shouldn't even have really been meeting with this president, or maybe should have been standing up more for Australian values and the principles of international law. But that wasn't ever really on the table with this meeting. The pressure was all around making sure it went smoothly, getting a guarantee around AUKUS, and the Prime Minister, you know, he did that.
I mean, as you say, that's a pretty low bar, really. Were there any real improvements made to the AUKUS deal, or are we just kind of supposed to take Trump's word for the fact that these submarines will be delivered?
This is the wild thing, Eb. You know, we are apparently just taking Trump's word for it. You know, all of the media coverage has said when, you know, Trump was asked about the AUKUS deal and he dismissed the hedging that was being done by the Secretary of the Navy and said, oh, no, you know, don't worry, they're getting them.
What we're really trying to do is take the original AUKUS framework and improve it for all three parties and make it better and clarify some of the ambiguity that was in the prior agreements.
What are the ambiguities? Well, firstly, I think President Trump answered that question emphatically. I mean, we are working very closely with the United States in respect of AUKUS. AUKUS is underpinned by a very clear trilateral treaty between Australia, the United States and the United Kingdom. And so it's very clear what we're doing and the process.
And we're supposed to just believe that. Like, it's wild to me that so much media coverage treats Trump with so much credulity. Almost all of the Australian media coverage has said Trump, quote unquote, confirms AUKUS deal. Like that really means anything, like we can rely on the word of this Prime Minister, or like the fundamentals of the deal, which are pretty shaky, haven't changed. It doesn't matter what Trump promises, the fact that the US shipbuilding industry can't meet its own requirements hasn't changed. Trump can't magic that away. But again, to go back to our earlier conversation, success is measured just by Trump saying that we will get the submarines. But there's no actual substantive change out of this meeting. In fact, today, at the time of recording, the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, have kind of hinted quietly that there might be a few changes still to come from the Trump administration, from that Pentagon review that still hasn't been released. So it's still very much on shaky ground.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this has now got Trump's seal of approval, which was in doubt for a minute. Trump obviously notorious for being both predictable and reliable. So as you kind of mentioned, the fundamentals of this deal hasn't changed. There's nothing to materially alter the US's ability to deliver on its shipbuilding commitments. There's nothing that's altered. A lot of expert concerns around whether or not these are the kinds of submarines that really serve Australia's national interest. All the fundamentals are still there and really haven't changed at all. So in a way, nothing really to report on the AUKUS end of things. Situation normal. But the other big talking point, I guess, to come out of this meeting was a rare earths and critical minerals agreement. What do we know about the substance of that arrangement?
Sure. So there is a bit more substance around this, as the Prime Minister described it and the President described it, is something that they've been working on together for months. And this is around, as they call it, unlocking investment in critical minerals development and particularly in processing. And so they're talking about joint US-Australia investment in projects in Australia and in the United States, as I understand it. But again, the devil is in the detail with all of these things. So this is being billed as a $7-8 billion agreement. But as I understand it, about $5 billion of that is expected to come from private investment. So this is all kind of future money, shall we say, and it relies on private investors who, of course, want a return and want stability, and that's been one of the roadblocks to critical minerals development in Australia as well. But certainly, again, diplomatically, this is widely being hailed as a success for the Australian government. It's being hailed as confirmation that the United States still cares about us and still needs us, and is certainly being framed in that usual great power competition way around, Australia and the United States needing access to critical minerals and needing to make sure that China in particular doesn't have a monopoly on supply of these rare earths. So, that's very much playing into the hands of, I think, what we might describe as China hawks in the US administration, and aligning Australia much more closely, if that's even possible, aligning Australia much more closely with the United States.
The other moment that the media, I think, has been a bit obsessed with is the slightly awkward moment that you referenced earlier between Kevin Rudd, the ambassador, and Trump. I believe it was a Sky journalist that brought to the president's attention some of those disparaging comments that Rudd had made prior to the election. What did you make of that exchange?
I mean, it was embarrassing and cringeworthy, wasn't it, Eb? And it's not at all surprising that the Australian media is obsessed with it. They've long been obsessed with Kevin Rudd for, somewhat understandable reasons. The thing that always gets me about this is the way that it's framed as Rudd, criticising Trump, but the substance of his criticisms is never really outlined in the coverage. But I think it's important to remember that Rudd was rightly identifying Trump as a threat to American democracy around January 6th, and in that sense was standing up for the shared values that our relationship with the United States is supposedly based on.
And he was not inaccurate in that assessment.
Exactly. And that's that weird thing where we kind of pretend so often that we can suspend reality in the diplomatic world and that it's not related to what's happening domestically. But I've always argued, and I argued at the time, that Australians should be proud that their ambassador was standing up for, the principles of democracy and was concerned about the threat that Trump posed to American democracy. But of course, that's not what we talk about. We just talk about, whether Rudd is viable, whether he can continue in that job, how cringeworthy it was. Like, it's pretty embarrassing.
I don't believe he should stay in that role. And to see the Prime Minister actually laughing at his own ambassador in the room, I think it's untenable.
Susan Lee, the opposition leader, was calling for him to resign as ambassador or for him to be sacked, I think. But in the end, none of that proved. I mean, we've just talked about what a diplomatic success the meeting was. It certainly hasn't proved any impediment to securing this meeting or securing what the government clearly seems to think is a fantastic outcome.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, this idea that we should be, handing an ambassadorship over to someone who's kind of closer to the MAGA movement that just seems ridiculous to me. Is there any actual merit in appointing diplomats in a way that's kind of close to the administration, even if it is entirely problematic?
No, I mean, I totally agree with you, Eb. It's such a shallow way of understanding diplomacy, and of course, the opposition in this sense is going to want to score free kicks around Kevin Rudd. They've long been arguing that Kevin Rudd should be withdrawn in favour of someone like Joe Hockey, who is closer ideologically to Trump. But like the idea that a Labor government would appoint someone like that to an ambassadorship is just ridiculous, but also, falls into this trap of thinking that, we have to cozy up to Trump no matter what he does, that, you have to put somebody into that position that, an American fascist likes and gets along with. And that's certainly not how I would approach it. And I think you're right. Again, credit where credit is due. It appears that Rudd has, done his job and done it very effectively in making sure that this meeting went smoothly, in doing the work around this critical minerals deal, in doing the work around getting this, confirmation, as it's being described, around AUKUS. He's doing the job that the government wants him to do. And if that's how we measure success, then I think he's been very successful. Again, I think that's very narrow, and I would be encouraging the ambassador to keep standing up for democracy and the rule of law. But that's not how we approach it at the moment. And if we measure things by the parameters that we're given, I think Rudd's doing a good job.
So something that didn't come up in the meeting was the genocide in Gaza and the so-called Trump peace plan. Before we kind of come back to domestic politics for either the United States or Australia, what is the latest with the so-called ceasefire? What's been happening after Trump secured this so-called peace plan?
So I think, what we've seen here is not a dissimilar pattern to what we're seeing with the way that Trump's so-called confirmation of AUKUS is being framed, that Trump will make this big announcement about something that he's done. He'll make some proclamation like the war is over or there is a ceasefire. And it's largely believed and regurgitated by a lot of the media coverage around the deal. So, there's this media framing of Trump announcing a ceasefire, and how did he do it? That ceasefire was always shaky because Trump is not interested in building lasting and genuine peace in the region. He's interested in winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And so he negotiated a ceasefire with Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu, didn't include any Palestinians, any of the neighbouring Arab nations who need to be included in a lasting, genuine peace-building process. And so it was always, that's a long way of saying that the ceasefire agreement was always shaky for that reason. And as the media would describe it, that ceasefire was tested very quickly when there were, what are described as tensions over the return of the bodies of hostages. The Israeli government accused Hamas of delaying that, and Hamas responded that, actually retrieving bodies out of the rubble of Gaza is an incredibly difficult task. And so as part of that, the Israeli government has then suspended aid temporarily. That apparently the flow of aid has reopened into Gaza, but there have been airstrikes since. 26 people were killed in Gaza as a result of airstrikes in just the last couple of days. So the ceasefire remains, I think, quite shaky, and it is also becoming apparent that in the 20-point plan that Trump and Netanyahu came up with, what is described as phase 2, which is, the part after the ceasefire, it turns out there's not a lot of detail in that, and all of that process is still being worked out. So it's not clear, for example, who is even going to contribute to what they've called the International Stabilization Force that's supposed to act as really a peacekeeping force, I think, in the Gaza Strip in particular. Even that hadn't been worked out. They hadn't talked to anybody about what that might look like or who might contribute or what they might contribute. So Trump has sent in his envoy, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to start working out the details. And, the choice of those two people kind of tells you all you need to know about the approach.
Yeah, that's not exactly inspiring choices there. I want to come back to, I guess, domestic politics for both the United States and Australia. The Prime Minister has talked about the relationship as being between two countries that have really stood side by side for freedom and democracy. But I don't actually see a lot of evidence of democracy in the United States at the moment. The news out of there is just consistently more horrendous every day. And even though we kind of knew it was all coming down the pipeline, it's still nevertheless kind of deeply shocking, I think, to see the way in which and how fast the Trump administration has been able to dismantle US democracy. I mean, just how dire are things at the moment?
They're pretty dire. And it is, you're right, it's shocking even, when I think you can see with relatively clear eyes what is happening. And it is so striking how much of Australian foreign policy is driven by habit. To hear the Prime Minister say that about, standing side by side for freedom and democracy in the White House when President Trump is literally, like, on the same day having part of the East Wing of the White House demolished so that he can build his $200 million ballroom.
Privately funded.
Yeah, privately funded ballroom, exactly. And he's demolishing the People's House that doesn't belong to him. He's supposed to leave it in a couple of years, and yet he is building his own ballroom with private funds, some of his money, which kind of tells you that he's perhaps not intending on leaving, right? And he's been signalling this much quite recently with more talk of 2028. Steve Bannon, that architect of Make America Great Again and the Trump movement, has been doing the rounds of right-wing media talking about the many options for having Trump on the ballot in 2028, even though, of course, that is unconstitutional. And alongside this, the Supreme Court is effectively poised to gut the Voting Rights Act. That will happen probably fairly soon. And you have a president who over the weekend during the No Kings protest was tweeting, he posted this AI video of himself wearing a crown, flying a fighter jet, literally dumping, I don't know.
Shit.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Literally dumping shit on protesters, on AI versions of American citizens. It is absolutely wild and grim. And again, to juxtapose that against this kind of weird suspension of reality happening in the White House with the Australian Prime Minister is deeply shocking, I think.
It's the enemy from within, all the scum that we have to deal with that hate our country. That's a bigger enemy than China and Russia.
We will prevail over the forces of wickedness and evil. They cannot imagine what they have awakened. They cannot conceive of the army that they have arisen in all of us.
We will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country.
The Democrat Party's main constituency are made up of Hamas terrorists, illegal aliens, and violent criminals.
I want to stick with those No Kings rallies you just mentioned because they're obviously a backlash to this descent into authoritarianism in the United States. Obviously, we've seen ICE conducting a lot of illegal arrests and raids in deeply problematic and violent ways, in unconstitutional ways, I'm sure a lot of people would argue, but the courts holding out at some levels, but certainly not necessarily backed up by the Supreme Court. I mean, things are pretty dire, and we saw those just enormous protests over the weekend. How do you think the political establishment is responding to these grassroots protests, from both sides of politics, I guess? We saw Trump. What about the Republican establishment, and how are the Democrats responding to that massive public movement?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe we can start with Republicans as well. We spoke about how Trump responded, and in many ways that's predictable. But it's also been really striking that his press secretary, Carolyn Leavitt, has been out saying wild things about how the protesters are all, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but they're all communists and Hamas sympathizers and illegal aliens, dismissing whole swathes of the American population as Trump would characterize them as enemies from within or vermin, which he did back in the election campaign. So there's this effort to completely other any opposition to Trump and frame it as illegal, which of course plays into the kind of oppression that you were alluding to there, Eb, with ICE arrests in particular, and that kind of suppression. So that's pretty grim. And then the Democrats still seem unable to unite around a strategy to oppose Trump. So, of course, you have the progressive wing of the Democratic Party expressing huge support for those protests. Bernie Sanders, AOC are, of course, their keynote speakers in a lot of the protests. Chris Murphy from Connecticut is also really vocally supportive of this. It's also been interesting to watch Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, who is shifting his opposition, I think, in response to reality. So he did this pretty amazing interview with Politico last week where he was, talking about Trump, what we were speaking about earlier, that, Trump's not going to leave. There's this amazing spectacle of Newsom saying this and saying Trump's not going to leave, like we're going to lose our country if we don't do something about this. And the audience is kind of laughing.
I have 24 Trump 2028 hats. His folks keep sending me.
And you think he's going to run again?
No, who spends $200 million on a ballroom at their home and then leaves the house? This is serious, guys. This is serious.
So it'll be Newsom Trump.
Yeah, he's really trying to sound the alarm.
Yeah.
And people are kind of taking it as a joke.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's kind of like a podcast bit and not, something deeply serious. So that reveals, I think, that this inability is still of so much of the political establishment, I guess, if we can call it that, to take Trump seriously, perhaps because he hasn't threatened them yet directly. But the actions of that political establishment and of the leadership of the Democratic Party in Congress in particular just seems unable to deal with the reality of Trump. And when you combine that with the institutional inability to respond to him, the inability of the institutions of law in particular to constrain him, that paints a pretty worrying picture.
I have been really interested. It does seem like a lot of the most steadfast opposition and people kind of really outlining this threat, particularly of running again, and the constitutional implications of that, and really naming it as authoritarianism, have really come from governors rather than the Democratic establishment at the federal level.
Yeah.
Gavin Newsom really, he's been doing, I think, a great job on the one hand of kind of demonstrating the emperor has no clothes and using a lot of Trump's rhetorical flourishes and his approach on social media against him. But him and Governor Pritzker, I think, I thought have, been really vocal and public and prominently trying to sound that alarm bell in a meaningful way. Do you think those protests and how many people attended are an indication that there are at least like large sections of the population that are now very alert to these risks and what's genuinely at stake? And do you think they were big enough to kind of prompt a more concrete reaction from the Democrats, or do you think that will just continue as is?
I mean, I think that's a really difficult question to answer. I think it's worth pointing out that Trump is deeply unpopular, and what he is doing, the full suite of his policies is deeply unpopular. We had Liz Pancotti from Groundwork Collaborative on After America a couple of weeks ago, and she was outlining, just how dire the polling is around Trump. And I think the No Kings protest, the numbers of people out on the street absolutely indicates, that there is strong grassroots opposition to Trump from a number of angles. So, in terms of his authoritarianism, but also in terms of his economic policies, his failure to address economic inequality, healthcare inequality in particular. So there's a broad opposition to Trump as well. And I think those No Kings protests indicate the potential for a grassroots movement against Trump and the Trump movement more broadly. And historically speaking, that's generally how, the United States has emerged out of crisis before, and how it has revitalized itself through those grassroots protests. I think what is different this time around is the coordinated, concerted effort on the part of the far right and the Trump movement to consolidate its power. We're having this coalescing of a moment where the right has more power perhaps than it's ever had, in that sense that it has Congress, it has the Supreme Court, and it's thought this through, really, really carefully. I wrote a piece for The Conversation a couple of weeks ago and did a little bit of research on ICE recruitment, and it's something that's really stuck with me because I think it reveals how much this movement has thought through how to consolidate its grip on power and how to suppress dissent. So with this ICE recruitment, so this is recruitment for I think they call them deportation officers or something like that. They offer a huge salary, which in a cost of living crisis and an insecure America is very appealing, understandably appealing to people. But they're also offering a $50,000 signing bonus and student loan forgiveness.
Just a cash bonus of $50,000.
Yes.
Jesus
exactly.
Christ.
It is wild, especially, again, in the context of that ingrained inequality that we've spoken about. And so this recruitment is happening for a certain kind of person. The recruitment drive is framed as literal blood and soil nationalism around protecting the homeland. So it's recruiting a particular kind of person and is going to hold on to them through those incentives, while it is simultaneously purging the United States military of effectively anybody who's not a white man.
Yeah.
And telling all those people at the same time, as Trump said, you can do whatever the hell you want.
Yeah.
Right? So
these are the enemy within.
Yeah, I'm sorry this is so grim, but, even as someone who's, I read Project 2225, I know how much they planned this, and that was shocking to me, how effectively they've planned this and how much they're recruiting people to the cause who will enforce the Trump agenda against American citizens.
I guess the news of that $50,000 signing bonus, which I hadn't clocked that's absolutely enormous. And it also makes me think of, the US government, am I wrong? Is it still in shutdown?
Yeah. Yep, it is. It's amazing that, I forgot this until this morning. It's still in shutdown. It is, if not the longest, it'd be close to the longest shutdown in recent history, at least. So things are grinding to a halt. Again, we had Liz Pancotti on After America a couple of weeks ago, and, she was describing all of these programs that are designed to help vulnerable people, vulnerable parents who need baby formula, for example. Those programs have all lost their funding. Airports are having trouble finding staff because airport security officers aren't being paid. And the Trump administration is also, of course, using this as an opportunity to lay off thousands more federal workers and, again, further consolidate their power. So, there's lots of commentary around, will this hurt Trump, won't it hurt Trump? But so much of it assumes, politics as normal, that this is a normal election cycle and, that who gets responsibility for the shutdown matters. But I'm not convinced it does, given all that we've just spoken about.
Yeah. So all of that is, as you rightly said, extremely grim. How can the Australian government respond, or how does it need to respond, or how might we expect them to respond when it's so clear that our two democracies are on different paths now?
Yeah. Maybe if I start with the last bit first, to how do we expect them to respond? I mean, I expect them to keep responding the way that they have, to go to the White House and have those meetings and seem to act like, it's business as usual. You're dealing with a volatile president, of course, but that, you can still say we are two countries who've stood side by side for freedom and democracy. So I expect we'll see more of that. I expect we'll also see more pressure from the Australian community for the government to be stronger in its defence of the principles of the rule of law, at home and internationally. And I think we can ask that. We can ask that the Australian government do more things like, for example, recognise the state of Palestine, despite the fact that the US administration really rails against that and responded quite strongly to that. I think we can draw lessons out of that it is possible to make independent decisions and defend them. It's not easy, but it's possible. So I think we absolutely can expect more from the government in that sense. We can demand more transparency around what the government is doing, particularly around consolidating the AUKUS submarine deal with the United States, where, we still have a Prime Minister dismissing questions from the press pack about details, saying we don't announce those things here. I think we can demand more transparency. I think we can demand, as we have been, a parliamentary inquiry into the AUKUS submarine deal. And we can demand that Australia does stand up for Australian values as the government defines them, as freedom and democracy and the rule of law. And again, I think, pressure will continue to build from the Australian community around that. Poll after poll indicates that Australians are really deeply concerned about Donald Trump and what he is doing in the United States. So it is possible, I think, to stand up to Trump in a considered and principled way that doesn't fall into the trap of, seeing diplomacy as not achieving much at all, but maintaining the status quo.
Well, it's been, if not a pleasure, talking about all these grim things. It's always at least a delight to talk to you, Emma.
You too, Eb. Thank you.
Thanks for helping us stay on top of the bin fire that is the United States at the moment. Thanks so much for joining us. If you want to see more scrutiny of AUKUS, you can sign the Australia Institute's petition calling on the Australian government to establish a parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS. You can find that at australiainstitute.org.au. And if you want to read more about the US-Australia relationship, don't forget you can buy Emma's Vantage Point essay, After America, Australia and the New World Order, for just $19.95 from Australia Institute Press. Find all that and more via our website at australiainstitute.org.au/store, or you can tap the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 22nd of October. Our theme music is by Blue Dot Sessions. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.